What's going on, booktube? Today I'm going to be going over my favorites of 2022. And funny enough, it's my second time recording this. The first time the files somehow got damaged or corrupted, and when I went to open them on the computer, they weren't there. So don't know what happened, but I wanted to share my favorites with you. So second time's a charm, not third time. Let's say second time's a charm for this one. Anyways, so 2022 was a great year. I'm going to be talking about 5 of my favorites because I only read around 30 something books. I can't remember what my wrap up said, but I didn't want to take 10 of 30. I thought 5 would be a really good number. Instead of going like, hey, these 10 of my 30, like that's just 1/3 of your books. I wanted to say like, hey, these are my favorite. These 5 books really stuck out of all the books I read in 2022. So without further ado, I'm going to talk about the very first one, which is Lies of Locke Lamora by Scott Lynch. And let me tell you, I think this was the second book I read on my booktube journey. It was right after Promise of Blood. And it was in the whole theme of, hey, I'm reading books that don't sound good to me. Books that I wouldn't typically read, but I hear a lot of people talk about. If I had to describe it, I would describe it as Robin Hood meets Peter Pan meets Grimdark. And that does not sound appealing to me. So like I was like, I don't really want to read this, but so many people speak so highly of this book. I'm going to give it a chance. Like I want to expand my taste. I want to explore what the fantasy genre holds. So I'm going to give this a book a shot. And now it's on my favorites of 2022. Not only is this a favorites of 2022, but it might be one of the most perfect books I've ever read. I'm not saying there's not things in it I would change or do a little bit differently. What I'm saying is the book was like flawless. Like sometimes there's breaks in character consistency. Sometimes there's flaws in the writing. Sometimes there's inconsistencies in the world. This book had none of that. It was one of the most perfect books I've ever read. Okay, second book on this list is going to be Dune. This book had to make it on it. It made me break my goal of not rereading any books in the year of 2022. I reread Dune. I experienced Dune in 3 different types of medium. I listened to it, I read it, and then I watched the movie. And I didn't want to do that. 2022 was supposed to be a year of exploring as much of the subgenre as I could, exploring as many authors as I could, starting new stories. Like that was what 2022 was. But Dune was such a shock to my system. I had to get more of it. So I listened to it, then I read it, and then I watched the movie. It was also a huge step for me in my sci-fi journey. Like I hadn't read a lot of science fiction books before then, and I didn't really understand science fiction as a genre. Like I didn't understand the intricacies between science fantasy, science fiction, soft science fiction, hard science fiction, and all that. So this was a entry point for me. And I know a lot of people say Dune is not a great entry point for people into science fiction. But as someone who had read only Star Wars books in the science fiction universe, I disagree with that statement. I think Dune was an excellent starting point for me. And I think that other people who love the fantasy genre, Dune wouldn't be a terrible starting point. So Dune definitely made it on my top 5 books of 2022, and I'm excited to jump into the second and third, fourth, fifth, sixth, the entire series come 2023. Getting ready for the second Dune movie. The next book I'm talking about is one that I've talked about a little bit more frequently recently, because I messed up by reading this book early, and that is Dracula by Bram Stoker. I read this book in May, I think, and I was dumbfounded by how good it was. Like this book, I was expecting it to feel aged. It's an old book, so I felt like it was going to be good for its time, but not one of the greatest books of all time. And I was wrong. This book holds up. Like it is so interestingly written. It's told through journal entries and letters and that kind of stuff, which makes it seem like even though it is aged a little bit in that sense, like some of the vocabulary used is different than what we would typically use today, and the prose is different than what we would use today. it adds to the horror element because you're like, hey, this was written during that time in their own hands, and you're just reading their private entries. The book was done brilliantly and ended up being on my favorites list. My biggest regret about this book was not waiting till October to read it. I am not making that mistake next year. I will read this book during Halloween in 2023. And on a side note, I actually can't find a edition of this book. You would think that there would be a million versions of this book that are just beautiful and outstanding, and I couldn't find one except for folios, which seems magnificent. Like, it's everything I could ever wish for, and it's on my to be bought list. Like, it's one of the next ones that I will actually purchase because I don't want to miss out on owning a copy of Dracula, and the Folio Society's version is the first one and maybe the only one that I think captures the story like it should. Actually, not captures the stories, but is as beautiful as the story is I guess what I'm trying to say. Best represents it, I think. Anyways, moving on to the next book on the list. It's City of Shards by Steve Rogers. And this is a self-published book, and it is one of my favorites because, first off, the world and the story are so unique and powerful that, like, the story itself needs to be on the list, and I want more people to read it. So, yes, you've heard me talk about City of Shards before. You're going to keep hearing me talk about City of Shards until people start telling me about City of Shards. But for me, it's even more than just the book. For me, it's also like a representation of my first steps into the indie world. It was the first self-published book I read, and the fact that it was able to blow me out of the water that much, it encouraged me to step out of my comfort zone and start reading more indie books. And I've found so many indie books that I enjoy now, so I owe that all to City of Shards. And can I just say, it is one of my favorite covers of all times. Period. Like, I love the cover of this book. And it's a good representation of the story inside. So City of Shards is definitely on my list of favorites of 2022. All right. The last book on the list before I start ranking the books for 2022 is going to be one of the books in the Wheel of Time series. And it was difficult because there are two books I think deserve this spot. And one of them is the first one, Eye of the World, which should have been on my Gets Better with Time list. I made a video about books that got better with time, and this first book, The Eye of the World, is definitely on there. But the book that made this list is actually the fourth one, The Shadow Rising, or The Rising Shadow. I can't remember what it's called. But it made the list because it is literally one of the best books ever written. The Shadow Rising was such a good book because Robert Jordan had spent the past 3 books building up to this book, it seems like. There was foreshadowing of the events in this book all the way back in the first one. So you knew some of the events were going to happen before they did, because the major theme in the Wheel of Time is history repeating itself with all these different little minor variants. So like, you knew the events of this book were going to happen, and you got to see legends play out in it. It was fantastic. It was world shattering. This book was so well done. It blew out all my expectations. And can I just say that it's so interesting that a Wheel of Time book made it on my top 5 of 2022. Because if you watch the channel, you know I have a weird relationship with the Wheel of Time. It is one of those books that I didn't really have an interest in starting. I didn't have an interest in starting the Wheel of Time series. The Wheel of Time is becoming one of my favorite series of all time, and I'm excited to continue the journey with it in 2022. But now that we've covered the 5 best books I've read in 2022, it's time to rank them. And I think I'm going to start with the lowest and go up to my favorites. So coming in at number 5 for the year is going to be City of Shards. The only reason why this book is at the bottom of this list is because even though the story is fantastic, the world is magical, and it was just one of the most unique books I've read in 2022, it did still have some flaws to it. It had some writing flaws. The ending didn't seem complete. It seemed like the first part of a bigger story. So there were some issues I had with it. But it's still, like, I don't want to belittle this book. This book still made it on the top 5 books I read in 2022 and is one of my favorite stories to date. All right. Next on the list, coming in at the number 4 spot, is going to be Dracula. And I put Dracula as number 4, not because it wasn't as well written as any of the others, not because the story wasn't as good as any of the others, but because, like, for me to read Dracula, I have to be in the right mood. Like, the next time I read Dracula will be for October next year during Halloween, when I'm in the mood to read Dracula. Like, that will be the perfect timing for me, and I'll have to have those specific parameters around it to really, like, want to read this book again. So Dracula was a fantastic book, fantastic story, and it's coming in at my number 4 spot. Number 3, this might surprise you, but number 3 on my list is going to be Dune. And I experienced Dune 3 times this year, so you would think that, like, hey, he enjoyed it so much, he experienced 3 times. I would have thought that was going to be his number 1 book of the year. But no, I don't know if it's like maybe me experiencing it 3 times caused me to be a little bit Dune fatigued, or maybe it's the fact that after spending a year exploring science fiction, I do prefer fantasy over science fiction. So maybe that's got something to do with it, but Dune is coming in at a solid number 3 spot for me. Okay, now instead of going to the number 2 spot, I'm going to talk about my favorite book of 2022 instead of going number 2 and then number 1. My favorite book of 2022 is The Lies of Locke Lamora. I truly believe that this is a flawless piece of literature. I'm not saying it's to everybody's taste. I'm not saying that everybody will read this book and say, like, hey, that's what I would have done too. Like, I'm so glad the story ended up this way. But I think that Scott Lynch did exactly what he wanted to do with this book. It was a book I wasn't expecting to love and ended up being my absolute favorite. So, Lies of Locke Lamora takes that number 1 spot, which leaves The Shadow Rising for my number 2 book of 2022. This book is literally one of the best books I've ever read. It might be the greatest book written, but it goes into that number 2 category because in order to enjoy this book, you have to experience it after the other 2. Like, it is so good because of the work Robert Jordan did leading up to The Shadow Rising. So The Shadow Rising is an amazing book, an amazing story, and literally might be my favorite book of all time. I don't know. Way of Kings is my favorite book of all time. But it might be up there. I don't want to belittle this book, but it is good because of the work Jordan had setting up to it. The Lies of Locke Lamora can be read as a standalone. It can be read as part of a series. It's a story in itself, whereas The Shadow Rising builds on the work of the other books before it. So that is my favorites of 2022. Hopefully the second time takes and there are no issues in the downloading, because I don't know if I have a third one in me. But anyways, that's my 2022 favorites list. Let me know what was on your favorites list, and if any of these made it on your top books for 2022. And until next time, I hope you're out there exploring cool new worlds and reading great new books, and I'll be back soon. Thanks for watching.